Who wants to live forever? Who wants to sail forever? Who wants to build a decent cruiser? Well, in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, lots of people did. But the trouble is, the definition of a decent cruiser was a bit different. It was a bit different. It depended on what you wanted from your cruiser. What was a decent cruiser? And you had roughly three examples of them because you had a world of technological change going on. Yes, you had fun. You had these things called steam engines, which were slowly going from being basically bombs you occasionally managed to harness for useful power to actually being a reliable source of power. You had the starting of establishing a level of infrastructure which could sustain that power for global operations, which is amazing. You had new guns coming into service that were firing, well, A, capable of rates of fire and accuracy which had heretofore only been dreamed of, and they're firing shells which are, for starters, are shells. They're things which actually do explode when they get impact, and you can even make them so that they explode after they've impacted, so that they don't explode on contact and go boom, immediately they hit something. They actually go in a bit and then go boom, which is even more fun. Oh, it's just a bundle of fun. And you also have a world which is increasingly industrial focused. Yes, interconnected and industrially focused. And it's never the level of connection which changes. The world has always been fairly connected. It's one of those interesting things. People sort of like to presume that the modern world is unique in being a global situation and a global scenario and a global market. It's not. Believe it or not, empires have grown fat on global trade for as long as there has been humans in, well, in settlements settled enough to start doing global trade to make it worthwhile, because there's no point turning up somewhere and going, oh, there's no one here for me to sell this stuff to. So you need to have a certain level of population concentration for global trade to work. But the moment you have that, some bright spark goes, you know what? They have a lot of very interesting minerals here, but they don't have silk. I will go and sell. I will go and take the minerals to a place where they do have silk. Of course, that means you need to have worked out there's already silk there. Yes, basically, people talk, things move the whole time. What happens as the world starts to industrialize, and let's be honest, the Romans were not that far off industrialization. If you look at some of their, especially some of their water mills, they were capable of early levels of industrial quantities of grain production and grain and flour, production. They were capable of doing that using the power of water, not steam, but water. As time goes on, humanity starts to industrialize. The pace of this global trade starts to increase, but also its importance does. Suddenly it goes from being an occasional boon, especially when it comes to the maritime trade, to being something which your lifeblood depends upon. And by the time we get to the last 3 decades of the 19th century, a time where some sanity has started to return to various navies in the world. As I've been said many times before, the Royal Navy in the 1860s is possibly insane. In terms of the way it perceives of itself, it has no real. It's constantly going, But we are the greatest. How are we the greatest? Um, Nero watching the world Rome burn while he plays a fiddle would fairly describe some of the admirals. Anyway, leaving that to one side, they come out of this decade and they start developing themselves. But other nations are just as happy to buy from Britain's industrial capacity as they are. And this was produced. This is William Armstrong talking about the Esmeralda, which is the first of the Elswick cruisers, as we would call them, really. He believed the Esmeralda was the swiftest and most powerfully armed cruiser in the world. Happily, she had passed into the hands of a nation which is never likely to be at war with England, for he could conceive no more terrible scourge for our commerce than she would be in the hands of the enemy. No cruiser of the British Navy was swift enough to catch her, or strong enough to take her. We have seen what the Alabama could do. What might we expect from such an incomparably superior vessel as the Esmeralda? Well, leaving aside the fact that he wants to sell cruisers of that type to the Royal Navy, so he is going to say how great it is. And by the way, for those who are watching this video, it is not the first time, nor was it the last time, that an arms dealer or manufacturer has sold to an ally a very powerful weapon system and then turned around and gone, oh, should that weapon system ever get in the hands of an enemy, oh god, how terrible our lives would be. Because usually that is a good way of showing off your wares, getting someone else to pay for it, showing the value of it because someone's being prepared to pay for it, and then manipulating your own government into buying something to counter it. Just in case. Welcome to the world of arms sales. Please note, though, the Esmeralda is merely a protected cruiser. Yes. She's not an armored cruiser, nor is she an unprotected cruiser, and there are both varieties going around. In fact, this is the General Admiral, which is the first armored cruiser in the world. Yes, it is a Russian vessel. That, of course, did not generate anything like a panic in the Royal Navy. Did not generate a panic in anything like any other navies. Ay, caramba. Why did the Russians build it? Well, because they had a large empire and they wanted naval power for the status they needed. They believed they should have one of the world's largest navies, that they should be just as powerful as Britain and France, the two most powerful navies in the world, that they should have a presence on the world station akin to their status as a major power. Considering the Russian cumulative industrial might at this point had about the same capabilities as probably a quarter of Sheffield at the same time, you might be excused for being surprised at this level of claim. But one thing that one learns through a study of history when it comes to Russian leadership, the people running things and the people in charge of things in Russia tend to have very different visions of what reality is to each other, let alone the rest of the world. Okay, there have been very few Russian leaders who could actually engage in what you would call real politic. Catherine the Great being notable as one of the few. Others have been sadly unable to. This is the reason why armor suddenly becomes important. It suddenly becomes rather problematic. If you have an unarmored ship, i.e., an unprotected cruiser, which is the cheapest and traditionally at this point the fastest, because remember, they're all sail powered still, vastly, majoritively, at this point. Well, if you get hit by exploding shells, you would most likely not see the pearly gates. You'd probably be stopping somewhere around about the throne on your way in. And when I say that, I am paraphrasing from the writing of someone who quite possibly is one of my great, 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 possibly another great uncles. There's a dispute as to exactly where he comes in the family, as he wasn't exactly born in wedlock. But still retained very good relations with the family. We're just not quite sure whether he was the dad's son or the son, or the eldest son's son. Either way, leaving that to one side, he was a naval gunnery officer, and yeah, he was very infused by shells. Very, very infused by shells and their capabilities. And this is the point at which you start to realize, hang on, ships are going to need to be protected. It also starts to create a problem for a nation like Britain, because Britain relies on its fleet sailing around the world for its presence. However, if anyone can manufacture a monitor, or something similar, especially after the 1860s and the US Civil War, and let's be honest, the American manufacture of monitors was not exactly what we call a massive industrial process. There are some very interesting vessels built by the Confederates, and that's not before we even get to start on the Union construction programs. All this suggests that local powers can build the ships. They get their hands on the suitable guns and suitable shells, then the Royal Navy's traditional presence vessels, those lovely wooden walls, would suddenly be very precarious when on deployment. In fact, precarious becomes a sort of mild mannered phraseology for it. They would be downright at risk. And that's worrying. That's really worrying. And then comes the Battle of Pakusha, where, on the 29th of May, 1877, a rebel-held Peruvian monitor, Huascar, and HMS Shah and HMS Amethyst of the British Royal Navy end up fighting each other. Now, you're not going to have heard much about this battle. It doesn't get talked about really at all, as it's just one of those things which happens. This battle did see the first use of a Whitehead torpedo. It missed. It missed. The rebels had been using the ship they'd captured to harass commercial shipping, especially off Calalo, which was the main commercial port of Peru. This harassment included forcibly boarding some British merchant ships. So, HMS Shah and HMS Amethyst are sent, with the command of Rear Admiral Algernon de Horsey, to capture the vessel. Now, the thing is, Huascar is not the world's most amazing ironclad monitor. It really isn't. It had been built in 1864 by the Laird brothers in Birkenhead. Good old Camel Lairds. Yeah. Well, their forebears. It had been launched in 1865, October, and commissioned in November 1866. And, well, the Battle of Pakosha. They turn up. May the 16th, they appear in the port of Antofagasta, Bolivia. They picked up Nicolas de Piola, the Supreme Chief of Peru, and his entourage of followers, as they were planning on supporting the Peruvian government. And, well, they track down Huascar. They have an exchange of fire. Her guns were undermanned, and she fired just 40 rounds. Shah's mast was damaged by splinters. Shah fired 237 shots, Amethyst 190. They carried no armor-piercing ammunition. Huascar was hit 60 times, but her armor shield, which is, let's be honest, between 2.5 and 4.5 inches, gun turret 5.5 to 7.5 inches, and conning tower 3 inches, deck 2 inches. So it's a substantial, but this is not even Harvey armor we're really talking about. It's just armor class steel, which is pretty much steel. The shots all just bounced off her armor shield harmlessly. So in a last-ditch effort to sink her, 2 small torpedo rams from Shah attempted to torpedo her. Huascar escaped under cover of darkness. The rebel crew surrendered their ship a few days later to the Peruvian own squadron just 2 days later. The Royal Navy was sitting there looking like, what just happened? Because let's be honest, they sent 2 ships. They fired more than 10 rounds per round the enemy ship fired, and they achieved zilch. Nada. Nothing. Zero. Niet. Nout. I'm going through all the various symbols I know for zero. They achieved zilch. Algernon de Horsey was outraged, frankly. He was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Station. And yes, when he returned home, he was made commander-in-chief of the Channel Squadron, etc. And he was promoted up, but he was outraged. He had no great victory to go home and talk about. He had been, for all intents and purposes, defeated. At this point, the Royal Navy started revolutionizing. Guns and armor. So, here is the schematic of a protected cruiser versus the schematic of an armored cruiser. Please notice, the guns on the armored cruiser will be just the same as in a protected cruiser, so yes. Red lines, armored deck and gun shield. There would be gun shields also on the guns of the armored cruiser. Grey areas, protective coal bunkers. Please note how they're subdivided on the protected cruiser. That's to give them added strength and to give the protected cruiser added protection. It's all done with the idea of saving weight and cost. Because you have to remember, the armored cruiser is the most expensive and the most effective, but also usually the slowest or slower. Then there comes the Protector Cruiser, which is faster, cheaper than the Armor Cruiser, but less as effective in combat power because it doesn't have all that armor and all that coal. And as you can see, the Armor Cruiser is also tends to be a fatter hull. It's a fatter, more meatier hull. So the Protector Cruiser is sort of narrower. And then there's the Unprotected Cruiser, which basically has zilch. Okay, just has nothing. Fun times. So we have the Battle of Anjanos. Again, it's South America going hot. And this battle is most interesting because, again, it involves a very special vessel. The Huascar. Yes. It is technically 2 armored frigates, 2 corvettes, and 2 transports on the Chilean side, versus 1 monitor and 1 corvette on the Peruvian side. The forces are as such. For the Chilean, it is the armored frigate Blanco Encalada, and the Almirante Cochrane. The wooden schooner Virgin de Cadorora and the transport Matis Cusino. And the corvette O'Higgins and a gunned transport Loa. Now, there were a strategy, there were several forts, but here's roughly what happens. At about 0830 hours, the gap between Huascar and Blanco Encalada reached 3,000 meters, and Latour modified his route. Cochrane closed in too. Off Punta Anagamas at 0925 hours, Garau opened fire over Cochrane, beginning the engagement. Latour didn't answer. Approaching Huascar from its stern. About 15 minutes later, Cochrane retaliated from about 2,200 meters. Her 3 starboard cannons managed to cause damage to the monitor right at the start. They'd line themselves up well. The very first shot piercing Huascar's turret, wounding 12 crew members, and this is an important point, this is the first gun team. So they're the most trained and the best trained gunners. And they were manning the cannons. Another shot perforated the armor, just above and just below the waterline. But more importantly, it cut the left rudder chain, which meant Huascar was temporarily adrift. Cochrane, in contrast, sustains little damage. Now the fight goes on. It goes on. And it goes on. And the result is the Chileans have 1 kill. The Peruvians, their monitor gets captured. They have 31 killed, 4 missing, 162 captured. And this includes their commanding officer, Miguel Grau Sarmino, who dies in the battle. And again, the British are watching this, the Russians are watching this, the French are watching this. Okay, armored ships are fighting armored ships. The monitor doesn't necessarily win. What wins is if you've got armor and firepower. Oh, Kiledoki. Oh, and by the way, this is the same monitor which had seen off 2 of the Royal Navy's ships not that long ago. Okay. All right. Ouch. At the same point, engines are getting better. They're getting more reliable. So, why does this matter? Because one of the things that's been restricting in terms of how you build ships is getting them through the water. If you're limited to the power of sail, well, as anyone who does sailboat racing will tell you, the weight of the hull starts to matter. It really does. The problem with drinking iron brew and having a beard and a mustache is sometimes the iron brew gets caught in the beard, and then you're flicking it down. Sorry. So you have these engines. They're getting more powerful. They're getting more reliable. As they get more reliable, your ships can grow heavier. You are less and less dependent upon mass. You are less and less dependent upon being able to make your hull as feather light as it can so it can glide through the water. You can now brute force your way through the water. Who cares about the wind and the position of sails? You can apply power. And there are a fair number of officers and engineers who, in this period, sound like they are Jeremy Clarkson. I'm talking about, of course, the former Top Gear presenter, current Grand Tour presenter, well-known car journalist, and actually pretty good historian when he does a history show, screaming, "Power!" It's, how do I put it? It's similar to the whole Grumman, Wildcat, Hellcat, Avenger sort of scenario, where you're basically talking about building an engine and then attaching an airframe to it. The more powerful the engine, that is what's defining and shaping your hull. And it really does start to have an impact on the hull. Especially once you can start to build a vertical triple expansion engines and those sort of things, because you can build up instead of breadth, and you can start building multi-shaft designs, which can give you a lot of reliability. That's one of the critical things you have to consider. If you are entirely dependent upon engines and engines are unreliable, you don't want to just have one engine. You want to have a second. Which means you need space for a second. If you don't have space for a second, you have to go for sails. That's going to limit what you can do with your guns. It's going to limit your layout of your hull, and your shaping of your hull, and the weight of your hull. So engines becoming more compact, becoming more reliable, and allowing you to better space them. That's important. That is really important. And this is the process which we're going to end up with. The combining of the turrets from monitors with the broadside guns, eventually growing up into positioned guns, going and eventually becoming all turreted guns. This is the period where we're talking about that beginning. The idea was there for a while, let's be honest. Some of the ideas of turreted monitors and turreted warships have been around a long time prior to the American Civil War, had been around for a good, probably you can actually trace them back even further if you want to. There are certainly some very interesting drawings in the latter parts of the Napoleonic Wars. But it takes time for the metallurgy, it takes time for the power to provide to be there to provide them with the firepower they need and the horsepower they need to move. Because sail power isn't going to give it to you. So, in this period, you end up with unprotected, protected, and armoured cruisers. So, this is also a period where you can expect me to find it particularly annoying. Because, as you all know, having heard me probably rant about it a couple of times now, I do not like it when governments build ships which are less capable and less survivable than they can do. Now, this doesn't mean I think you don't need to build the smaller ships. I'm talking about things like the York and Exeter when you're building the full fat counties. There is no point building the dark county. There is no good real argument other than you're planning on saving money. And when you don't even save money, it is actually not a worthwhile investment. You are just sending people off to war in a less capable machine than they're supposed to be. Now, you will need to build unprotected, protected, and armoured cruisers. So, now, depending on what kind of nation you are, you might decide one of those fits your price point better than the others. The probably sensible price point to go in for is the protected cruiser. Add in some torpedoes, it might have a chance versus an armoured cruiser. Probably not much of one, but they'll have a chance. It's basically the light cruiser of the period. The armoured cruiser is pretty much the heavy cruiser of the period. And the unprotected cruiser, I suppose if we wanted to, we could call that a destroyer leader. All of them have advantages and all of them have weaknesses. But they also cause a rather interesting interplay. Because, in theory, an unprotected cruiser, which is fast enough and is armed with armor piercing shells, could in theory do a lot of damage to an armored cruiser. The reality is, it's unlikely. But there again, an armored cruiser has to be careful when taking on an unprotected cruiser, because if you're firing armor piercing shells at an unprotected cruiser, there is a possibility those shells will pass straight through and cause no damage at all. There's also there's the more realistic possibility though that they'll hit something important, go kaboom, and the entire ship will be golden bulleted like HMS Hood. That is a very real prospect, which you have to live with. It's going to be interesting, and this is why I have saved the cruisers of this lovely, lovely period of 3 decades for a special at the end of the year, because I thought you'd all enjoy them. And it will start tomorrow. There are roughly, I think, there's about 14 videos in the series, I think. Let me check. I haven't recorded them all yet. There is 2, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 videos currently in the series. There might be a 14th added in, I'm not sure. Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy them all. Tomorrow's video will be HMS Inconstant, an unprotected cruiser. And we'll get to General Admiral on Saturday. Then it'll be HMS Shannon on Monday. Then it'll be the Velasco class on Wednesday. Thursday it'll be the Leander class of 1882. Friday the Esmeralda class of 1883. Saturday the Imperius class of 1883. Monday Sphinx of 1884. Wednesday Egda class of 1890. And Thursday the 15th the Columbia class of 1892. Followed by Geffen on Saturday the 17th. And that's 1893. What I will say as today's question. And I'm hoping you're going to enjoy this one. Unprotected cruisers. Would you have built them or not? If you had the choice, please go have a look at that in that period and see if you are as a navy whether you would build unprotected cruisers or whether you would rely, as the U.S. Navy seems to do to an extent, although they do build a couple, on ships taken up from trade fulfilling the unprotected cruiser role. In which case, you need to have the munitions capability available for when you need them in the Spanish American War. But no. Unprotected cruisers. What would you be using them for? Would you even be building them this period? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care and have a nice day.